We come today to the last quarter of this year-long inquiry. Its title is the Parayana. It's like paradise, paranormal. It is para, which means beyond, generally above, beyond. It connotates actually going across to the above, beyond. And yana is the Sanskrit for way, the Mahayana, the great way. Not vehicle is sometimes wrongly ascribed to it, but way. So this is the way across to the beyond. And one of the dominant themes running through this year-long inquiry is the appreciation of time forms. And it is the appreciation of time forms that contributes our coming confidence in being able to develop an analytic of civilization, to, for the first time, come to the competence and the ability to have an analytic that resonates with an appreciation, an aesthetic, so that the art and science of civilization, for the very first emergence in time, can be appreciated and analyzed. And this is an important step for us, because our capacities now have not only become super, they have become supercluster super. We are not only leaving the confines of our world, our planet, for other worlds, other planets, in fact, quite rapidly in terms of history, for other star systems. We are leaving the sophisticated species that has been stable for us for 40,000 years to a refinement of species. What was for 160,000 years Homo sapiens transformed 40,000 years ago through art, through the ability to have vision, to enter a vision field, and to have a new dimension of person come through that experience of entering into a fifth dimension vision field, to make a prismatic person that is able to make paintings, to make sculptures, to choreograph a maturation beyond the merely cultural, beyond the merely ritual and myth, yes, and even including symbols, to be able to reach a new quality of understanding, of wisdom, so that Homo sapiens, wisdom man, for 160,000 years, began a transform again, a second transform into Homo sapiens sapiens. So the tradition by now with designation is to repeat sapiens. So it isn't just wise man, but it's wise about being wise. To arrange one's life and persons, one's individuality, one's group, one's culture, one's even society, so that what is encouraged is a further maturation, not just to mature in terms of nature and its cycle, or even taming nature in the form of plants and animals, taming minerals and metals, And finally, fifth, taming themselves to be able to explore. The Homo sapiens sapiens over the last 6,000 years have been entering a third transform. A transform that has taken a number of very large cycles, which are not just cycles, but because consciousness has played the creative, remembering roles in this double transform, that a third transform has become apparent increasingly, while civilization has been going on its double chiral spiraling into a new maturity. Now it is possible for us to understand that we have entered into a refinement of species that best can be designated Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man, man whose home is not a culture or a multicultural world, but it's an entire star system, a stellar civilization. On the frontier of interstellar space and on the frontier of interstellar worlds almost beyond number. One of the problems is to be able to understand what is this cycle which with consciousness has become an ecology. How does the refinement of that ecology accumulate the energy to not only sustain itself, but to mature and mature further? It has become apparent increasingly over the last 6,000 years that the dynamic that occurs has to do with time. And it's only 2,000 years ago that it became apparent to those few who were carrying the energy wave of time, the frequency of its occurrence, that time, in fact, has not only form, but it has forms, which mean that there are analyzable sub-forms, so that one can begin, at least, to understand what is going on in terms of the larger development. Two aspects occurred 2,000 years ago that were paired, like the two hands coming together, the two eyes, the two ears, the symmetry, that there was something to do with the way in which conscious Homo sapiens made a transform of nature all the way through its cycle. Nature itself welcomed this further dimensioning. And it was as if, as one began to understand that the transform of within nature by the field of consciousness could be applied by persons prismatically who were able then to look at what they do with what they have, the ritual actions with the ritual selection of objects, of phenomena, that the phenomena and the actions together made a practice which could be refined and increased, so that ritual itself became refined through this transform. That language, the oral language of communication, which had been developing for quite some long period of time, our neurological and physiological human structure was capable of a very refined language when Homo sapiens first emerged from the tree with all of its branches of primate life, especially the Homo series. Homo neanderthal, for instance, our closest relative on this tree, was physiologically, neurologically not able to speak like we are doing currently. They were limited in the sounds and the sound control. It's in the thoracic region of the spinal column that the complication is not just with the larynx, but its intimate tie with the breathing, so that when I am speaking in the way I am to you, which is perfectly normal and natural for us, I neurologically, like you, are able to modify my breath some 60 times per second, ongoing, in increasing complexity. All of this was not available to even Homo neanderthal. After 160,000 years, when the refinement of the Paleolithic forerunners of civilization came into play with art, there was a different quality that the time of nature began to have an ability to have another quality in it, not quite a second tier, but another quality. As long as language was oral, it could develop, it could mature Homo sapiens up to about 6,350 years ago, where there were very large villages, almost like proto-cities, but there was not yet a civilization. It was like high cultures, very mature and developed. With the development of a written language, about 4350 BC, everything changed. It began a momentum that comes down to our own time, that the refinement of time, forms, and civilization is by the increasing complexity and facility of a written language with a consciousness which is differential in visionary access, which is kaleidoscopic in historical flow, complex flows, so that the art and the science available, refined together, the arts and sciences, since the Renaissance, we have always understood. They make a new learning, just in time for 500 years ago, the, quote, discovery of the New World. That there's a whole other half of the world that one can explore, and it turns out to be an inhabited half. Our time is consistently alerted by something that is a subsidiary complement to the carrier wave of these stages of refinement of language, where it begins with a seed, and that seed, those seed persons, that seed time, is a reference wave. And it is extremely difficult because for the first time, as a doctor of civilization, in this work, it is available to refinedly bring a quality of dimensions, which is not only the natural cycle of 4 dimensions, or the ecology of consciousness in 4 further dimensions, making an eightfold. But they together form a complementarity, which is a 9th. And that 9th quality is evident in many, many aspects. One of the founders of subatomic physics language was the one who introduced the word quark. And that was Murray Gell-Mann at Caltech, a fellow professor with Richard Feynman. And in his great book on this, with a co-author, it's called the Eightfold Plan for how one comes to the subatomic realization that subatomic particles like protons and neutrons are made up of quarks, and that they cluster together in such a way that they almost never occur individually, they always occur in pairs, but the pairs accept a third. And when the third comes together, when you have three quarks, they come in two massive, important varieties. They come in a positive electromagnetic charge, the proton. They come in a neutral electromagnetic charge, the neutron. And that those neutrons and protons make the atomic nucleus, which has its ability through the proton to attract the electron, which is a negative particle weighing some 1,800 some times less than the proton. And yet it is the orbital levels of the electrons that convey the qualities of different elements to the atomic structure which is common to all of them. And it is the interaction of subatomic particles like photons with subatomic particles like electrons that are able to produce the qualities of livingness by which the variety of elements can come together in a very complex, grand, tiered, 8-tiered matrix and produce out of the 92 elements refinements of qualities that are peculiar and particular to each individual element. And when those elements are brought together in such a way that on the atomic level, with the exchange of electrons, they can produce molecules. And it is this way that one begins to understand that we have come to understand not only the atomic structure of species, but the molecular structure of civilization. Our reference wave is about 1650 AD, with Newton and Leibniz especially, but with a concomitant there of developments in China, of developments in Islam, of developments in many areas of the world, that one, for the first time, begins to understand that time forms of civilization are not just the property of those pioneering it and developing it, but that there is a distribution of that energy, which is time, in the space, which is the other three dimensions in nature, and that the spatial distribution in a time sharing is what gives reality as we understand it and live it, its juice and its substance. One of the great difficulties that has emerged in the last 50 years, 100 years preparation, 50 years of refinement, at least as far as my endeavor and concern has been, is that the problem is that regression on a massive scale occurs in clinging to old reference waves when a new carrier wave has been introduced. And the classic case for us is illuminated by 4 qualities of previous reference wave from 1650 to 650 AD. And if you look at 650 AD, the outstanding qualities of that reference wave mature not in the next carrier wave. A whole new reference wave sophistication will be the forerunner of the next carrier wave. But the previous reference wave is not a reference wave of carrier waves, but a reference wave of millennia, of a millennium. And this is where the problem of civilization becomes exacerbated beyond control. One has the carrier wave of 650 AD mature about 1000 AD and play itself out. It took about 100 years for it to really come into firm play. By about 1100s AD. But if you look at the way in which the reference wave of 650 occurred, 2 of the most outstanding, powerful aspects of that reference wave, that millennial reference wave, had to do with the birth of Islam and the pinnacle of Chinese civilization. So that in our time, with our carrier wave of 2000 AD, actually the apex of its emergence was 1991. The rejection of the reference wave of mathematization of written language, of calculus, integral and differential, of the way in which a mathematic refines the ability to read and write language which now is a universal language. The language of written mathematics is universal. Refusing that reference wave in preference for the previous reference wave sends us back into a scenario where the millennium plays itself out again like some zombie world view. In Islam, it wasn't just the appearance of Muhammad and the genius of his ability through his life to come to an understanding that there had been a dead end to the Christian revelation in his time, everywhere, a malaise, that indeed had been a transform of the Judaism that went back to, in fact, from 650 AD, where Muhammad was, it went back not just 1,000 years to Alexander the Great, which it did, but went back a second 1,000 years to Moses, to the development of Judaism as a Torah, and that before then was a whole development that had, as the Mosaic understanding of it was, 400 years of slavery that erased everything that was accomplished before, so that one had to redo everything. But for Muhammad, it wasn't that. It was that the previous outstanding figure was not Moses, but was the previous outstanding figure to Jesus, because that had been the big transform. And that figure was Abraham. And so Islam has a great appreciation that they are a part of the inheritance of civilization's dynamic because they are children of Abraham. Not only are they children of Abraham, but understanding that Abraham had more than one wife. It isn't just that he had Hagar, an Egyptian woman who was the maid in waiting to Sarai before she gave birth. Sarah's name was Sarai. It wasn't just that Hagar had the first son of Abraham, Ishmael. And when Sarah gave birth, finally, to Isaac, there was immediately a kind of a challenge that came into play, a divine challenge. Remembered in the Mosaic way as Abraham seeing in a vision that he must sacrifice his son. And so he, living by the Spirit vision, took Isaac out into, it wasn't very far to go into the wilderness, to sacrifice him, to kill him. But he passed the test, and in a bush there was a goat that had entangled itself through its horns into the bush and was bleating, and Abraham understood that he was able to give this animal sacrifice in place of his son. But later, the concourse of that happened to be that Sarah became jealous of Hagar with her older son Ishmael, and finally forced Abraham to send them into exile, into the wilderness, so that Ishmael became literally orphaned in the wilderness. And it was only through the grace of the protection of God that he was able, and the mother, Hagar, to survive. But even further, Islam understands what is only a sentence in Genesis, in the Torah, but is one of the most telling sentences in the entire Old Testament. That Abraham had a second wife, not just a concubine. He had children by her. Her name was Ketubah. She gave him 6 sons. And those 6 sons were not allowed to be a part of the patriarchy, of the inheritance of Abraham, according to the Mosaic Torah. So that the 7 sons of Abraham, other than Isaac, other than the patriarchy, are the founders of the different tribes of what came to Muhammad, of the moment for Islam. We are the inheritors of 7 sons of Abraham. We have a patriarchy which is immense. That particular clinging in the late 20th century, early 21st century, ignores the reference wave of the mathematization of written language, of Newton, of Leibniz, and of many other things, and goes back to the reference wave of 650, but it was the reference wave of the millennium. And so what replays out is not the choreography of the previous reference wave, but what it was a reference wave of. And what replays out graphically, what was happening at the millennium, the preaching of the Crusades. which even that has been completely misunderstood. And in terms of really refinement, has been corrected for almost 2/3 of a century already. The great first mature history of the Crusades was in 3 volumes. The first volume came out in 1951 by Sir Stephen Runciman, who was able to read and write all of the languages, Persian, Arabic, you name it, Greek, a real genius. A History of the Crusades, Volume 1, The First Crusade. Its subtitle is And the Foundation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So that the pivotal hook, it's not just a sticking point, it is a hook. Any kind of bait on that hook that you go for, that hook will catch you. So that Jerusalem is the epicenter of all of the earthquakes happening from a dysfunctional time form understanding and appreciation. But it goes further than that. In the China of 650, the most powerful dynasty of China was being formed, the Tang Dynasty. Its founder, his family name was Li, and his given name Shimin, almost like Zimin currently. It's paradoxical. Li Shimin became known as Tang Tai Tsung, the heavenly master of the Tang Dynasty. And he was really somebody. He's commemorated, like Alexander the Great, 1,000 years before, of having the greatest war horse of the age. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, a black stallion that was with him on every military campaign where he was victorious. Tang Tai Tsung, with his war horse, made the war horse the symbol of the Tang Dynasty, which reached not just the China that everyone is familiar with, but out past all of the mountain ranges and passes, out past even the origins of the rivers like the Yangtze and the Yellow, reached all the way across the Gobi Desert into what is today Central Asia, and reached all the way down, not just into the wilds and mountains and tribes of South China, but into what is today called Indochina, was immense. It is that dynastic reference wave that produced a millennium in China. But in the 20th, 21st century, is producing a regression back to this dynastic imperial China to expand itself. And now we have the technical capacity. The whole world is available to us. In fact, the moon and everything else is available to us. We are the new dynasty. We have the example in history. We have the trigger. Let's pull it. Let's get it. Just like Islam, China now is in a deep reference wave regression, but has difficulties because it's not living in the Tang Dynasty. We're not living in that glorious, within 40 years of Muhammad, by 670 AD, Islam had spread from the cities of Mecca and Medina to take all of North Africa and to move into the reaches of far Iran, Persian Empire, and within another generation they were in Spain heading to France, They were in Indonesia, heading towards wherever they were going to go. The lure of a grandiose reference wave is that it reproduces almost automatically the millennium, not the new carrier wave. There's more, but that'll be enough until we take our break. Let's come back to a very serious problem, which has been diagnosed now for The Crusades were not about Western European Christian knights taking the Holy Land back from the Muslims. It turned out that way, but the initial trigger for it, which Sir Stephen Runciman's The Crusades, is the classic first time that anyone understood enough, was conscious enough, in person, through vision, in comprehension of history, that the real dynamic of the Crusades was the Western European Christians wanting to take the imperium away from the Byzantine Empire. So they went not just to take land from the Arabs, but they went to take back the land leading up to Christendom's focus pivot of Jerusalem, because they didn't want it to have any longer the imperium of the Byzantine Empire, of Eastern Christianity, of Orthodox Eastern Christianity. And concomitantly, it involved Islam as well, enormously. The Crusader people, the Crusaders, had a skewed view of the Byzantine Empire, of Orthodox Greek Christianity, but they were completely ignorant of Islam. All that they knew, especially in the England-France combine, that was like the generating center, and Spain as a part of it as well, in that triumvirate, was that Charles Martel in France had stopped the spread of Islam dead in its tracks. Charles the Hammer, he was called in medieval times. And was able progressively to roll back Islam so that it was not a problem of military capability, but it had to do with the structural innuendos that had developed with the classic time form that had come through in 0 BC 1 AD, the refining carrier wave of Christianity. Now, so powerful was that refining wave that it not only affected everything involved, all of the cities, all of the peoples, all of the territories, but was able to send out resonances as far afield immediately. Living disciples, family of Jesus, reached the west country of England, reached the Irish Sea in 37 AD, reached India in 41 AD, reached the upper reaches of what we now know as Turkey and Armenia, reached down into Africa, not just into what we know as Ethiopia, but Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula, and further because of the great ties that the civilization of Sheba, yes, the Queen of Sheba, reached way down into trade and everything into Africa. So it had this enormous swath within a handful of years. Jesus was crucified and resurrected in 36 AD. Within 5 years of that, all of this had happened, was underway. What happens with a carrier wave, which is endemic in the way in which civilization has developed its time forms, is that there is a hook that comes into play like a saboteur that snags the import, the significance of the carrier wave into an increasing complexity of problematic alternatives and of corrupting sabotages, and within about 100 years, less than that, 2/3 of a century, one has the kind of reinstatement of the carrier wave, but instead of in its original visionary quality, its restatement, to make a reinstatement of it, becomes emphatic with understanding something has interfered. A spirit, the previous carrier wave of 0 BC, 1 AD, which 100 years after that is about 100 AD, 90, 100 AD, is the emergence of the great apocalypses. St. John, who was a personal witness to all of this, as a young man, when he first saw Jesus, he was 9 years old. His brother James was about 8 or 9 years older than he was, and taking care of his younger brother. They had heard of Jesus all his life because their mother was one of his sisters, Salome. So they met their uncle when St. John was 9, and older brother James was in his late teens, 18, 19 years old. At the Last Supper, St. John was 12. His older brother just 21. All of this is characteristic where a carrier wave coming up on about 100 years comes into an apocalyptic need to reinstate because of the regressions complexifying into corruption, plural, so that there becomes a fraying. And the fraying no longer is able to be a conduit of the energy of time and begins to fray. Think of an electric wire, which now the insulation frays first, and then the wire begins to corrode and begins to short out, begins to spark and start fires. And you have this in terms of the greatest dynamic in the universe of time, amplified by the time forms of a increasingly powerful civilization, which doesn't have just one kind of time, but it has a triplex of civilized times plus natural time. You have a whole quaternary of time signatures, 3 time forms, and a time in nature which is not the 4th dimension, but is the 1st. So that you have the energy of the way in which dimensions occur in the first place. You have the transforms in triplicate of the refinement and maturing of civilization in its time forms. The carrier waves, the reference waves, and those men and women who are the pilot wave, who begin to vision and understand and who are able to see through the prism of their artistic, creative remembering, and they make the kaleidoscopic consciousness of history to work with this. The appearance of the apocalypse, the book of Revelation, occurs about 90 AD. It's an epical date, if you will, because it is a date where the maturation of the carrier wave has reached a gorgeous filigree of development at the same time that the hook become a snag now begins to tear at the very fabric of civilization, especially in regard to its tendency, its compulsion to be reeled in by that hook, by that snag, into a millennial form of the apocalypse. Now a crusade planet-wide on so many levels, almost no one is able to understand. Now, Sir Stephen himself lived to be in his early 90s. His library, by the way, was in a Scottish medieval tower, about 3-4 stories high, and it was on those levels, and in order to go through his library, one had to go up the spiral staircasing. It wasn't until the 1-volume illustrated abstraction of the 3 volumes, which are very academically superb, Cambridge University Press. The 1 volume was made because there was another study of history that was in eventually 13 volumes. That was only begun to be understood when a 1-volume illustrated edition of it, abridgment, came out. And that was Arnold Toynbee's The Study of History. Now, these are people that devoted long lives completely. They began in childhood and went all the way through 9 decades almost of life and refinement. It takes a long time, even to acclimate much less to open and expand the opening, to make the access openness, so that the visionary field of differential consciousness is able to be present. And that presence of consciousness gives the prismatic person the ability to do something which has spiritual repercussions. They are able to behold, not just to hold, but to behold with all of the dimensions, not only of a 5-dimensional conscious space-time, but a conscious time-space, which is personal, which is like a 6th dimension. And once you have that kind of a 6 geometry, quality, you begin to have a very powerful, stable form for the development eventually of an analytic. Every snowflake is a hexagon. Every cell in a beehive that makes the storage for the honey is a hexagon. The hexagrams of the I Ching. The 2 triangles that make the hexagon of the Star of David. You have a stable structure which is able to be understood not as a 2-dimensional or even as a possible 3-dimensional form, but of a form that can be refined, that has a crystalline structure, has a capacity to be refined, to have that crystalline structural capacity be refined by the art of a written language, so that the written language, and now because the written language is powerful in this way, it can cut new surfaces to the crystal structure and begin, because one is prismatic, to make a prism of what you are dealing with, a prism of the person, to the extent to where it isn't just a crystal but becomes a jewel. And that jewel person is able quite easily to live in a kaleidoscopic history and to make a science which is not only in a field of cosmic openness that is conscious, differentially conscious, that appreciates the integral qualities of a 4-dimensional world that has phenomena, that has actions, that has life, and to cherish it like a child, like a newborn animal, like a seedling plant, like minerals that are there not just to be exploited, but to be cherished, that they're there, and metals, and persons, etc., etc. Open-ended, all possible worlds. It is important to understand that it takes a long learning to mature Homo sapiens sapiens to become Homo sapiens stellaris. It takes, since it's been activated with the reference wave in 1650, that's already 364 years, almost 365 years, almost a year of years since it was activated and begun. And the 2 hands not of the way in which there was just a 0 BC, 1 AD carrier wave, but it matured itself through a lifetime, and for about 45 years matured itself so that it was really not only able to be present beyond cosmos and to behold cosmically, but also to be able to mature and guide in terms of the natural cycle of phenomenal, active, character and characteristic worlds. The beholding is active and becomes supraphenomenal through sharing, so that one becomes aware that in our carrier wave is a carrier wave of shared presence, which has no limits. Its capacities are not neutered, but are gender complementarity, all possible worlds. Incredible varieties beyond belief. It has the hook become a snag, become a ripping in the current world, which cannot be stopped by any kind of function that is immersed in that scenario at all. That entire nightmare they used to call in the previous aeon that one had to awaken. Our understanding now is that there isn't a solution, but there is solution. The old alchemy. The solution dissolves the old form structure into its, the term used to be the mysterium magnum. Not just the great allness, but the great primordiality out of which all can emerge. All is in every, all even as in universe. We call that scientifically now a plasma. And the plasma specifically is a quark gluon plasma. Quarks are able to hold hands and welcome a third. And in that stable triangle, that family, you can have protons, you can have neutrons of all kinds of structures, and even beyond. One can have atomic elements transmuted. Lord Rutherford, in his last book in 1937, the title of it was The Newer Alchemy. And the first thing that is made is a caution. The first thing that is made is the most poisonous element in the universe. It's plutonium. A minuteness of that element with a half-life approaching geologic times will kill any life, all life. So that the subatomic world came immediately with this caution that one must be not only gentler than doves, but wiser than serpents. It's like the genie let out of the bottle. It's not going to go back in the bottle. And is not there just because you have wishes to be fulfilled, but generates qualities that you are not prepared for unless you transform. And it's that guidance that requires a program like our Learning Civilization to mature yourself, not aside like something which you go to have an education, or you go to have a retreat, or you go to have a therapy, but to have it active like a yeast in a baking. Because you're going to make bread out of that grain. And you need to know there's lots of varieties of it. And you have to well knead it and bake it patiently. And you can live better than ever. It is a quality which comes strikingly with the development of a procedure that was beautifully expressed in 1974 by the great Irving Goffman. It's called Frame Analysis, an essay on the organization of experience, published by Harvard. Goffman was a Canadian, born in the west of Canada, Alberta, where I taught for 5 years as a young man. Goffman, at the time of writing and publishing Frame Analysis, was the Benjamin Franklin Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. One of the great thinkers of the time. A frame, in the refined language of the Learning Civilization program, is a square of attention. It is the attentiveness to that delimited frame that allows for you to collect what is in it as the picture. It could be a very large frame. It can be a very big picture. The British Empire used to say, you've got to get the big picture. Well, the big picture exceeds any world you can possibly make out of any kind of order you can possibly dream up. But not only is it a frame, it's capable of undergoing an analysis. And Goffman is very, very sophisticated. Canadians can be very sophisticated. The greatest science fiction writer, A.E. Van Vogt, was Canadian, born on a farm just south of Winnipeg, Manitoba, 1912. He went to William James, who was a watershed where anthropology and sociology were just beginning in his lifetime. And psychology was just beginning to have some kind of a sense that it was a discipline. And philosophy had undergone many challenges that eventually produced a complete revolution in the development of pragmatism, which was even transcended by James, who died in 1910. His last lecture, and amazingly, was at Stanford, the young, new Stanford University in California. And it was a theme that was to be published after his death in a collection of essays and writings that led together, and its title was A Pluralistic Universe. And exactly at that time, in 1910, was the triggering of the first recognition that there was something valuable written that had been completely forgotten, in fact, left out of Christianity completely, on purpose, after hundreds of years of being not only a major document, but as the characterization of it now among those who have dealt a whole life with it, it was characterized as the first Christian hymnal, the Odes of Solomon. And yet no one, even in that illustrious group, that refined elite, that collection, that family almost of pilot waves, appreciates something that has been introduced here. The authoress, yes, a woman, of the Odes of Solomon, which were discovered in late 1909, early 1910, exactly at the time towards the very end of William James's life, that one could begin to appreciate and to analyze and understand that we had come to a cusp where the developments that had begun, by that time it was about 15 years since H.G. Wells had published A Time Machine, since the discovery of X-rays, since the discoveries of the electron, and it was beginning to seed and fertilize that seed, to begin the development where the germinal cell begins to divide in pairs, and pairing pairs and pairing pairs of pairs, and to give the field of the differential conscious play an opportunity to take cells made of molecules, made of atoms that come out of primordiality, whose dynamic is time. So that the real difficulty in a learning is to wean oneself away from a planned education, to learn to breathe and live and speak and write and read a super cluster of refinements of language that is in play now and must be idiot reduced to be slogans in some kind of a medieval, millennial, apocalyptic crusading of any kind whatsoever. Pro, con, indifferent, all-inclusive, whatever. Next week we will look at the way in which the maturation of the scientific and the historical, the personal and the visionary, took a cue from the development of H.G. Wells's year after year after year. The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, When the Sleeper Wakes, First Men on the Moon, year after year, like a rock star releasing an album every year, through the 1890s into the 20th century. The science fiction vision came to an incredible golden age maturation in late 1939, and came into a quality that was a rebelling against a recursion that had begun to set in the late 1950s and in the 1960s, and came into play in the early 1960s, where you began to have a new generation, a new vibrant restating of this science fiction vision. Classically is of greatness to us, and now is poignant to us. And we will talk about how the classic golden age in the early 1960s began to emerge. Writers like Philip K. Dick and Frank Herbert, where films like Dune and Blade Runner begin to characterize something that is now almost a half a century ago. And we are really far along, so that we have to run to catch up with the quality of learning that is possible. More next week.